It was the end of a remarkable life, but also perhaps of an era. Prince Philip's devotion to serving his country was forged in the long, dark years of war and cemented by his marriage to the Queen. Today, our political leaders paid their tributes.
He helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life.
We should deeply appreciate the massive contribution that he made to public life and to the whole country.
But, of course, with the Queen, the Duke met countless world leaders across the decades, and many of them paid their respects too.
He was a heck of a guy. He, it was his lifetime of service to the United Kingdom and the whole Commonwealth was visible to everybody for a long, long time.
He pledged to serve his country and his Queen, and so he unarguably did. On a specially extended programme tonight. A restless childhood, a stellar naval career, a remarkable love story, an outsider who helped reshape one of the world's oldest institutions, the grand sweep of an eventful life. Always there, steady, steely, people up and down the country reflect on what the Duke meant to them.
I owe a lot to the Duke of Edinburgh, and I just want to say thank you for changing my life pretty much.
He was a man of action, far ahead of his time on issues like the environment and the natural world. So what is his legacy?
Royalty in an indefinable way has modernised itself. In that evolutionary process, the Duke of Edinburgh played a very, very important part.
It was a love story, no question. So just what made the couple tick?
If a young girl falls in love with a very handsome, very dynamic man, he will be her hero.
And what about that famous sense of humour? It sometimes made headlines he didn't want, but he also made a lot of people laugh when they needed it most.
It was fun, a little bit risque, and I think we probably all felt, thank goodness there are people like that in the world.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Consort and constant in the life of our country, companion and confidant in the life of our Queen. Tonight, at Windsor Castle, she is in mourning over the death of the man she called her beloved husband in a statement released by Buckingham Palace shortly after midday. This afternoon, she was visited and comforted by their son and her heir, Prince Charles. The palace said Prince Philip passed away peacefully this morning. He was 7 weeks short of his 100th birthday. He died at Windsor, where the Queen is tonight, where they have been together during lockdown, and to where he returned just over 3 weeks ago after that month-long stay in hospital. Buckingham Palace is trying to discourage those wanting to remember the Prince from visiting royal residences or indeed leaving flowers because of the virus restrictions. But there has been some socially distant gathering. Tonight, the flag over Downing Street is flying at half-mast, where earlier in the day, the Prime Minister said the Prince would be remembered above all for his support of the Queen.
Moments after the official announcement, two courtiers walked across the forecourt of Buckingham Palace and, as has been the custom for so many years, they posted a notice on the railings. A notice which announced the end of an era, the passing of this country's longest ever consort. The Union flag above the palace had already been lowered to half-mast. The announcement was a personal one on behalf of the Queen. It read, "It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Further announcements will be made in due course. The royal family join with people around the world in mourning his loss." At age 99, the Duke of Edinburgh had led a very long and very fulfilling life. He had only officially retired in 2017, when at this ceremony he bowed out of public duties for good. Prince Philip had just spent a long spell in hospital. When he was discharged last month after 4 weeks of treatment for his heart and an infection, it was the longest period he'd spent in hospital. But the Duke was able to spend his final days with the Queen at Windsor Castle. He died in the place where his own mother, Alice of Battenberg, had been born in 1885. This afternoon here at Windsor, we are told Prince Charles drove from Highgrove to be with the Queen.
Prince Philip earned the affection of generations here in the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth and around the world. He was the longest serving consort in history, one of the last surviving people in this country to have served in the Second World War. We remember the Duke for all of this, and above all, for his steadfast support for Her Majesty the Queen. Not just as her consort, by her side every day of her reign, but as her husband, her strength and stay of more than 70 years. And it is to Her Majesty and her family that our nation's thoughts must turn today.
At Downing Street, as elsewhere in the country, official flags will now fly at half-mast until the morning after Prince Philip's funeral, the arrangements for which have been significantly revised because of the pandemic. And so too has the advice to the public. Many people had instinctively been moved to lay flowers, but in line with COVID restrictions, they've been urged not to, and also not to congregate at any of the royal residences.
Remembering what he's given to the country, to the world, it's wonderful.
It's a person that's been around for all of my life, and I'm really sad.
And because he has been part of national life for so long, for more than 7 decades, the flowers did keep coming, despite the official advice. This was Windsor Castle this afternoon.
My heart just breaks for the Queen and the family, because she lost her husband and such a stability in the country, I think, the royal family. So, yeah, just deeply sad.
And in the capitals of the United Kingdom, the moment was being marked. At Piccadilly Circus in central London and in Edinburgh at the Palace of Holyrood House, the same announcement was posted outside.
He lived a life of public service and deep devotion to the Queen. He had a close association, of course, with Scotland. He went to school in Scotland. I know that he enjoyed all of the time he spent at Balmoral.
The Duke of Edinburgh will be sorely missed by the many Welsh organisations that he supported as patron or president over so many decades of service.
It is with deep sadness that I have learned of the death of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. It is a sadness that I know will be shared by countless others in Northern Ireland and right across the world.
The perimeter of Windsor Castle is as close as anyone will get to the funeral. And as the flowers and messages to the Queen grow outside the castle walls, inside them the Duke of Edinburgh's body will lie in rest. He never wanted a state funeral, despite the duty he'd given to his country and to the Queen. And because the couple were here together for the duration of the various lockdowns, Windsor was where the Queen and her husband spent their 73rd and final wedding anniversary in November. At the place where they were married in 1947, Westminster Abbey, the tenor bell started to toll at 6 o'clock this evening. It tolled every minute for 99 minutes, one for every year of the Duke of Edinburgh's life.
What a remarkable life. What a wonderful life of service, of duty, of service to his country, service to the Crown, but with this formidable intelligence, insight, and a really extraordinary prophetic gift.
During the many years of her reign, the Duke of Edinburgh has been at the Queen's side through the happy times and the challenging ones. Her advisor, her confidant, her debater, her rock, her husband. The widowed monarch must now begin the task of signing off the amended funeral plans for her husband.
You would frankly be hard put to believe the story of Prince Philip's life. He fled his native country as a baby stored in a fruit box, was educated in Nazi Germany under a Jewish educationalist who was forced to flee, Philip effectively going with him. He fought Hitler in the long, dark years of World War II with distinction, witnessed the Japanese surrender, and all by the age of 25. Shortly afterwards, he married arguably the world's most famous woman, gave up a stellar naval career to help care for and serve her in a time when such a decision was almost unique, and then stuck by his promise with steely resolve right up until his death today. You can really pick your epithet. Colourful, certainly. Remarkable, undoubtedly. But unusual and interesting too.
He was born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark on the island of Corfu. His mother was Princess Alice of Battenberg, which made Philip a great-great-grandchild of Queen Victoria, just like his future wife. But when he was just 18 months old, Philip and his family fled Greece after a coup. He was to find a new home and a future through the Royal Navy.
His Majesty walking down the ranks of the cadets and afterwards...
At the Naval College in Dartmouth, an encounter that changed his life and a nation's history. Sharing a joke on this photograph is 18-year-old Prince Philip. He'd been asked to entertain the King's daughters during a royal visit. Elizabeth, at the time, was just 13. Afterwards, they played croquet. It was clear she had taken a shine to the tall and dashing cadet. War would interrupt any romance that followed. He was mentioned in dispatches. They exchanged letters.
It's easy to see the radiant happiness of the princess.
And the coming of peace brought the rekindling of love. King George granted permission for the couple to marry. He renounced his Greek title and was given another.
Now the Duke of Edinburgh takes a fatherly hand, his technique being no better and no worse than most fathers.
Philip still had his glittering career in the Navy, but that came to a premature end with the death of his father-in-law. So what next for a young man of prodigious energy? At first, frustration.
Nobody had really thought about, and by the way, what's he going to do? And it took a little while to find people who understood that he had extraordinary experience and skills of his own that could be made very good use of. But he also found ways in which he could make an impact.
Philip was a moderniser, and he crashed against convention.
I think in those days the footmen still wore powdered wigs. It was a different world. It was a Victorian court. He seemed to be almost dangerously progressive.
Yet progress prevailed. A new monarch and a new style of monarchy for a new age of mass media. It was Philip who ensured the coronation was televised.
I, Philip, will become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship. In faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die, against all manner of folk, so help me God.
Rising, he kisses the Queen's cheek. And
as ever with Philip, when duty called, he answered. These revealing images, shot during a royal trip to New Zealand in 1953, were kept private for 70 years.
What's this for?
But Philip believed the royals must appear more real and more relevant in less deferential times.
Oh, why have you done that?
Though his gamble to allow television cameras to record a year in the family's life was an experiment never repeated.
He came to realise that it was possibly a mistake, because once you start selling yourself as people, as individuals, you begin to make yourself into a soap opera.
Do you realise this is guaranteed failure?
And I think one of his regrets of the later part of his life was that the royal family had become something of a soap opera.
Friends joked that while his wife wore the crown, Philip wore the trousers. The Duke took charge of the family side of what even he referred to as the firm. never more tested than in the collapse of the marriage of his oldest son. Philip was supportive of Princess Diana. Like her, he was once the royal outsider too. Her death unleashed a wave of public anguish that turned to anger, directed at a royal family that seemed out of touch, though those planning the funeral remember the Duke as protective of his grandchildren.
We got a real sense that this was a grieving, mourning family up there, and they were looking after those boys and tending to them incredibly closely. I mean, they were the grandparents.
One heartbreaking image lingers, and it was the Duke who gave the young princes the courage to follow the funeral cortege, while he walked with them every step of the way.
Memory's a strange thing, isn't it? But I seem to remember saying that, in fact, it was a question of, if you'll do it, I'll do it. And that was him as a grandfather saying to his, if that's what you want to do, and if you want me to be there, I will be there.
A reassuring pat on the back.
The firm survived, and later that year, when the Queen and Duke celebrated their golden wedding anniversary, she paid him a rare public tribute.
He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years.
It says much of Philip's lifelong will to succeed, to make a difference, that he took up carriage driving at the age of 50.
Oh, you idiot!
Despite the dangers. Royal milestones came and went, but he was slow to slow down, reluctant to retire. To the end, this was a partnership. To his wife, to the monarchy, Philip has fulfilled his promises. John Ray, News at 10.
And Chris is here to talk about all this. Look, John was talking about their partnership. I don't think anyone who ever spent any time covering them or with them in any way could miss their immense shared sense of humour, their companionship, and really that sense of a remarkable partnership. So a huge step for anyone to lose a spouse of more than 70 years. But when you're carrying the weight of the crown too, that's just a massive, massive thing, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, the crown is a very heavy burden. And I think if you speak to any president or prime minister, they'll say it's a very lonely job at the top. And all of them will say how much support they've received from their spouse. And I think when you step back and you look at the amount of time they spent together, from that wedding in 1947, when Britain was in rack and ruin after the Second World War, the country was still living off rations, all the way through to today, his death today. That's a mightily long partnership, and you look at pictures now of the two of them together over such a long period of time. That's where the sadness is tonight. Not the sadness of the death of a man who was 99 years old. He led a very long, a very fulfilling life, but sad for the Queen, who's lost that constance at her side. And at Windsor Castle tonight, where they've spent a lot of time over the past year. Let's be clear, but the lockdown has meant they spend a lot of time together. The live shot here of Windsor Castle tonight, that's where the Queen is. That's where, by all accounts, the funeral will happen in the coming days. We know Prince Charles has been in to see his mother tonight. It will be a very lonely place to be for someone who's had him at her side all that time.
Well, you mentioned the funeral. Obviously, the arrangements, will not be what they would have been in non-COVID times. So what can we expect over the next week or so?
No, and I think it's important to point out here that lots of people have had to get used this year to having funerals they never expected to have, and not in the sort of shape they expected them to be. And therefore, just as for everybody else who suffered over this past year, the funeral plans will have to be dramatically changed. The Queen's job, really, kind of her first job as a widow monarch, is to sign off the new plans for the funeral. There were processions in London. That's clearly not going to happen. Everything that happens with the funeral has got the COVID pandemic in mind. No risk to public health, no congregating of members of the public or anything like that. So that's going to be her first job. It looks like, we don't know the details yet, but it looks like it will all happen behind palace walls in Windsor. He'll be buried in St George's Chapel. People know that, of course, from Harry and Meghan's wedding not so long ago. But that chapel has been a focal point of royal family life for centuries, and so it will be again in the coming days.
I often think at moments like this, one of the real shocks, we're so used to the royal family, the Queen particularly, and the Duke being there as just constant, always there, always steady, always reliable, always the same. And for a lot of, in a changing, uncertain world, that has a sort of massive value. And I think particularly for the Duke, who, effectively we're losing one of the last of the Second World War generation. So there's a real sense of that, I imagine.
Yeah, and do you know what? Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was saying tonight, there's only 5% of the population who have lived longer than the Queen and the Duke, or remembers the time before their wedding.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of us, all we've known is the Queen and Philip, that partnership, just in the same way that we speak of Victoria and Albert. I mean, it was a partnership. The second Elizabethan era, if it is to be judged a success, will be in no small part because of the role that he played at her side throughout, just supporting her all that time. And that, that's what she doesn't have anymore. So you're right, the royal family does have that constance, but it does evolve and it changes all the time, just very slowly. But what we're witnessing today is history. It's a significant moment of change.
OK, Chris, we'll come back to you at the end of the programme, but for now, thank you very much indeed. As Chris was saying, only those around 80 years old and over will be able to remember life without Prince Philip at the Queen's side. That's how long he's been part of our national life. Yet respect for the job he has done in supporting her cascades through the generations and stretches to all four corners of the kingdom.
His life spanned generations, but it was the youngest who came to Windsor's gates first, one offering a prayer to a prince who has simply always been there.
I think it's almost you see it coming, but you never really are prepared for it, so you just feel a bit almost speechless in a way.
At the Minster in York, the bells tolled 99 times, one for each year of the Duke's life. And somehow, despite his age, it still felt too sudden.
It was a shock, because I thought it was really on the mend. But, very, very sad. Very, very sad, yes.
As at all the royal residences, at Sandringham, the pandemic meant the public were asked to stay away. But they came regardless. Moments like this reminding us how we measure out our own lives against those of the royals.
Obviously, when Princess Diana passed away, my mum brought me down. Then I did exactly the same as my daughter's done. So, and I was only about, what, 5, 6?
On the Mall outside Buckingham Palace, the capital's black cab drivers also took a moment to consider his passing.
I never thought I'd feel back like this, when Duke died. But, it's something, it just hits you, doesn't it? You come round, you see the crowds and you realise it's one of those moments.
The flags at half-mast in Birmingham, the city's thoughts with those left behind.
I think it's a big shock for the family, but yeah, I just hope they're all okay. All eyes will be on the Queen to see how she's reacting and how her health holds up, because she's also quite old.
And in Scotland, they mourn not only the Duke, but also the lack of ceremony.
It's so sad, and especially during this pandemic, because the restrictions mean people can't pay their respects properly.
I know he wasn't well, but still a sad day. And when he was an army man, and he was obviously very active.
I think he was quite a character.
Yeah.
He didn't always say the right things, which people thought, but no, I thought he did well. I thought he was all right.
And that Glaswegian understatement might well have been appreciated by a man also remembered with 2 minutes silence at Aintree Racecourse.
We will now hold a 2-minute silence that will begin and end on the referee's whistle.
The empty football stadiums, where he was silently saluted tonight, another reminder that in these unsettled, uncertain times, the Duke's steadfastness will be missed even more deeply. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
So exactly what will happen next following the death of the Duke? Tomorrow at noon there will be a 41-gun salute across the UK, in Gibraltar and on ships at sea. They will take place behind closed doors but be broadcast online. and on television. People have been laying flowers at royal residences, but due to COVID restrictions, they're being asked to instead leave tributes in an online book of condolence. As per the Duke's wishes, there will be no lying in state. His body will remain at Windsor Castle, nor will he have a state funeral. There will instead be a ceremonial royal funeral at St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, which will be televised. Buckingham Palace will confirm the arrangements in the coming days. And until 8 a.m. on the day of the funeral, all official flags will be flown at half-mast on government buildings. Now, Dan Rivers is at Windsor tonight. Dan, people were asked not to come, but inevitably people, they were clearly doing it in a respectful way, but they do want to come and pay their respects.
Yeah, that's right. And we saw, a steady stream of people throughout the afternoon into the evening. It's much quieter now, it must be said. A more reflective atmosphere, to be honest, both here and on the other side of the castle at the Cambridge Gate. At the Long Walk. I just went up there and it really is quite a special scene. You've got this carpet of flowers lit up by the flickering candles and lanterns that have been left there by well-wishers. The initial thought we were told was that those flowers would be cleared away periodically to sort of stop it becoming a focal point. I think they've obviously decided to slightly amend that plan because they've left many of them there this evening. I presume they will be taken in at some point overnight, but a very special scene there. They had put out at the palace this afternoon an advisory asking people not to bring flowers and actually asking people maybe to consider doing a sort of charitable donation instead, perhaps to one of the charities maybe that the Duke supported and was a patron of himself. And they reminded people that there is now an online book of condolence that is open on the Royal website where people can leave their thoughts and memories of the Duke.
Well, as you say, people have been coming. You've been talking to many of them all day. What have they had to say in essence?
It's an amazing variety of people, actually. What struck me with, complete range of ages. We've seen, tiny little kids leaving flowers in really very poignant scenes to people well into their 80s and older still coming, of many nationalities as well. Lots of foreign accents and foreign languages heard as well. So a huge variety of people, many of them from Windsor itself as well. Some I spoke to had travelled here from other parts of the country. They were a little bit conflicted about whether they should have done so, but felt it was important to mark today in as safe a way as they could. Many people from Windsor itself have come and come up to have a look here, and many have mentioned the Duke's long association with the castle, especially after that devastating fire in 1992. He was so involved with the rebuilding here, and fitting many felt that he should be buried here next week.
Dan, thank you very much indeed. Well, Prince Philip was a man with true global experience and reach. During the course of 70 years of service, he visited more than 140 countries. At home, he played host to visitors from the world over. He saw 13 American presidents come and go during his time as consul. Today, the 14th, Joe Biden said the prince had lived an exemplary life, defined by bravery and duty and a commitment to youth and the environment.
This is a special report from CBS News. Now to breaking news from London. Buckingham Palace has just confirmed that Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, has died at the age of 99.
Americans woke up to the news from London.
We have breaking news from Buckingham Palace this morning.
The death of the Duke dominated the breakfast shows.
Breaking news this morning, the death of Prince Philip.
And this afternoon, the president spoke of his sadness.
Jill and I and the entire administration send our condolences to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on the loss of Prince Philip. He was a heck of a guy. He, it was his lifetime of service to the United Kingdom and the whole Commonwealth was visible to everybody for a long, long time. And his bravery serving in World War II, as well as his being a champion of the environment, as well as the charitable things he set up. So we really do express our condolences for extraordinary life that was led by the Prince, and I think he's going to be missed, particularly in the United Kingdom. But 99 years old, he never slowed down at all, and which I admire the devil out of him.
The red carpet was laid down in Virginia for the Queen when she arrived in the States.
The Queen and Prince Philip had made several visits to the United States. The first way back in 1957.
It was obvious that the Queen and the Prince were thoroughly enjoying it all. What a contrast in transport next day as the royal couple arrived in the President's plane at Washington.
They met American presidents from Eisenhower on.
Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth is made royally welcome.
Notably joining America's bicentennial ceremonies at the White House in 1976.
Accompanying the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh.
Barack Obama tweeted this tribute. Through his extraordinary example, His Royal Highness Prince Philip proved that true partnership has room for both ambition and selflessness, all in service of something greater. Our thoughts are with Her Majesty the Queen, the royal family, and the British people. In Ottawa today, the Canadian Parliament's bells tolled 99 times. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saying the thoughts of all Canadians are with the Queen and the entire royal family. Baroness Scotland, on behalf of the 54 countries of the Commonwealth, spoke of the debt of gratitude that she felt.
I think it is hugely painful for the whole Commonwealth, but it must be heartbreakingly so for Her Majesty, and we send our prayers and our love not just to her and the royal family, but really for the gift that was His Royal Highness Prince Philip.
We're interpreting that story to bring you breaking news. Buckingham Palace has just announced his...
In Australia, the news was announced on the evening bulletins, and the country's Governor-General gave his reaction.
We give thanks for the Duke of Edinburgh's service, his loyal and loving devotion to Her Majesty, and his commitment to Australia, the Commonwealth, and all her people.
I cannot think of a more appropriate...
As the Queen's consort for over 70 years, international travel was a feature of the Duke's life.
In La Paz, capital of Bolivia, the kind of welcome the Prince has been receiving throughout his Latin American tour.
It wasn't always free of incidents or gaffes. But today across the world, the tributes are pouring in, and they are sincere and heartfelt. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
MPs will get their chance to pay their tributes to Prince Philip on Monday afternoon. The Commons will be recalled from the Easter break a day early, and Libby is in Downing Street this evening to talk about all that. Libby, in essence, MPs will get a chance to pay their tributes on Monday.
Yes, Tom, there will be that special session of Parliament on Monday, and all political campaigning for the May elections has been suspended as a mark of respect. As you would expect, there have been tributes from leaders right across the political spectrum today and from all four nations in the United Kingdom. I think the Prime Minister summed up the mood when he said that Prince Philip had steered the monarchy, steered the royal family in a way that maintained its vital importance to national life. I think he also marked the fact that when he spoke to members of his cabinet in a virtual meeting tonight, that Prince Philip had known 16 prime ministers. I think it's true to say that he had witnessed history. And of course, he made history himself too with his wartime record. We heard Joe Biden referring to it there in Robert's report. I think the fact that he did have such a distinguished record and that link with the Allied victory in the Second World War is something that makes his death not just a huge moment for the monarchy, but also a huge moment for politics and the country. He was also the longest serving consort, and I think his relationship, his partnership with the Queen provided an element of political stability that made other nations envious of Britain. He also, as something that the Prime Minister remarked on to his cabinet colleagues, provided a link to the future with that remarkable Duke of Edinburgh award so many of our children have taken part in. And I think that's why his legacy will endure for so long. He has, in a sense, made his mark on so many lives, so many generations. Now, as we've said, MPs will get the chance to pay tribute on Monday. Until then, I think we're going to hear very little from our politicians, and even next week when the country opens up as lockdown eases in many areas, I think we're going to hear much less from the politicians as they allow the country a period for mourning and reflection.
OK, Libby, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we look back on Prince Philip's past, it is easy to see now he was a man with an eye on the future. As Libby was saying, modern views of the heart of the monarchy. He had the vision long ago to realise the threat the human race posed to wildlife. He became president of the World Wildlife Fund, as it then was, in 1961. And even before that, in 1956, he set up the Duke of Edinburgh Awards for teenagers and 20-somethings at the suggestion of his former headmaster at Gordonston School. The three initials, D of E, have become part of the vocabulary and the lives of millions of people all around the world.
For 18-year-old Mercedes from East London, who's partially sighted, taking part in the Duke of Edinburgh's award has been life-changing and made lockdown more bearable. She's taken up running as she strives for her silver award.
I owe a lot to the Duke of Edinburgh, and I just want to say thank you for changing my life pretty much. And I'm going to help you carry on your legacy by encouraging everybody I meet to take part in Duke of Edinburgh.
Before the pandemic, teenagers could venture out on expeditions, gaining valuable skills for their life journeys.
Keep going.
The scheme not just about camping and cooking, but building confidence.
It's warmed up, yeah.
The Duke of Edinburgh described it as a DIY kit for growing up.
So who's going to take us to Huge House? Not me. Do you know how to get out there?
For many young people like these, taking their first steps towards maturity, the maps and the compasses have helped steer them.
Young people can learn how to go out by themselves, and then it makes a big impact because parents learn that their children aren't just people who need to rely on someone, that their children can be people who can go out and do things by themselves.
The main purpose of the scheme is to help boys to find activities which will give them pleasure and satisfaction.
The Duke launched the scheme in 1956. Since then, it's expanded to more than 140 nations, and more than 4 million young people have received awards.
People who are living in deprived areas who don't have opportunities, you have to, in a sense, provide that challenge, that opportunity.
After 65 years, his goal seems as relevant as ever.
He's left an incredible legacy. His vision and passion and belief in the innate potential and value of young people.
In all, the Duke was patron or president of more than 800 organisations. Nice. His support helped fund cycling lessons for children, a kayaking club, even flying scholarships for teenagers.
The photographer is Prince Philip, wildlife enthusiast of international repute.
He was also, perhaps less famously, but no less passionately, a conservationist. Here on safari in Kenya in 1971.
All of these animals and birds are within measurable distance of being exterminated unless something happens.
In his determination to draw attention to man's impact on the world, he was ahead of his time. And he used his status to raise awareness, becoming president of the World Wildlife Fund.
He recognised the sheer scale of destruction that we have been wreaking on our planet, and he importantly wanted to protect it for future generations. The fact that it's up the agenda today is part of his legacy.
Sir David Attenborough first met the Duke in the 1940s when they were in the Royal Navy. Here they are together in 2019. The Duke's legacy, he says, the evolution and survival of the royal family.
Royalty in an indefinable way has modernised itself, and in that evolutionary process, the Duke of Edinburgh played a very, very important part.
And so his legacy lives on in all those still being inspired by his passions. Rebecca Barry, News at 10.
Well, joining me now, I'm pleased to say, is Lord Alan West, who as a former First Sea Lord met the Prince and knows better than most about the power of Royal Navy service to shape lives. Thank you so much for coming in and talking about this evening. Can we just begin with the war? Because, I mean, millions of people watching, will have had family members who were in the war. I was thinking today about my grandfather who was sunk on Charybdis in the war. And it's very hard to get across to people just how wearing, how tiring, how frightening, and undoubtedly how formative his years must have been.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people forget. It was 6 years. We were fighting for 6 years from the 3rd of September when the Germans invaded Poland, right through until the atom bomb was dropped in Japan. That was very nearly 6 years. 6 years, 1 month short of that. And during that period, ships were darkened. All the normal risks, maritime risks there are, were amplified because you had no lighthouses, you had no buoys marking channels, all these were taken away. All the ships themselves were darkened at night, so, not colliding with the ship, you had to be really on the ball when there were lots of ships in a convoy and things like that. And this went on day after day. And the ships were much smaller. The corvettes and frigates were tiny compared with today's ones, so they were really thrown around by the sea, and on the mess decks and in cabins as well for the officers. There was salt water, they leaked, they rolled like mad, and at any moment, suddenly you might be hit by a torpedo. That's what happened to so many ships. And the Germans, the first merchant ship, for example, was sunk on the first day of the war, the Athenia, and the last one was sunk in the Atlantic battle on the night before Germany surrendered. So every single day, ships were suddenly being sunk. You were having to take charge of convoys. There was very little sleep. On a warship where you were helping run a convoy, say, for example, and the Duke of Edinburgh did a lot of East Coast convoys, you had to make sure that all of the ships there knew what was going on. You had to protect them against E-boats, against submarines, against air attacks. There were minefields everywhere. If you went slightly wrong, you'd go into a minefield and there were cases of ships being sunk. This was really hard, grinding work.
You can see clearly how that was a formative experience. Certainly in terms of his devotion to service, you can absolutely see that how formative that was. He always struck me as, in a way, quite typical of naval officers of that generation. Very, no room on any ship for anyone to be in any doubt what the captain thinks or what the senior officers think. Absolutely straight down the line. No messing about. This is where it's at.
Absolutely. I mean, that generation, they all called each other by their surnames. It seems funny nowadays for youngsters today that was the case. I mean, actually, my generation almost was still doing that. Yeah. But they all called each other by their surnames. They felt that showing emotion was not the right thing, but they still felt emotion. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the Duke of Edinburgh definitely did. The Duke of Edinburgh's probably one of his favourite tunes was Tom Bowling. That almost used to make him come to tears because he thought of friends who had died and things like that. That comradeship of the sea. But yes, they were brought up very strictly. There was a famous admiral who'd been captured by the Japanese, and when he came out of the prison camps, they said that must have been awful. And he said, well, not nearly as bad as Dartmouth. So, they had a pretty hard upbringing, and then those years of war, and it must have been wonderful when the war ended. Suddenly, ships with lights on. Suddenly, those threats and risks not there. And the period just after the war, when the Duke of Edinburgh was the first lieutenant, I think, of Chequers, and then he, of course, had his own command, the Magpie, must have been wonderful for him. And being out in Malta with Her Majesty, and as a naval officer, free from all of those huge pressures, it must have been wonderful.
Well, you say it's wonderful, and that kind of just only underlines, doesn't it, just what a big decision it was. The naval officers dream of command, I imagine. Finally, he's getting to that point in his career, and he takes the really epic decision to give it all up. Totally unusual, I would have thought at the time, to stand behind, to serve, to help, to assist his wife.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that this was a huge sacrifice, and he felt it as a huge sacrifice, but he felt it was his duty to do what he did. And to be honest, I think he was in love with the Queen, and he realised this was his duty. And again, part of what you were taught at Dartmouth and what you were taught as a naval officer is you do your duty and you do what's right. And I think he epitomised that. But it was a loss when he helped design the Royal Yacht Britannia, for example. In his cabin was a model of the Magpie. It meant that much to him. That was actually in the cabin, a model of the Magpie, always there whenever he went in the Royal Yacht. And he must have been, he must have thought often, I've given all that up. But he was then focusing on lots of other things, and he achieved so much, in his other life, so to speak. But I do believe he felt that was a sacrifice.
Just finally, briefly, what do you think his impact on both the Navy and the services generally was?
Well, I think in a funny way, our Navy, the senior service, the Royal Navy, was used to having someone who was about to be king in the Navy. I mean, classics were King George V, particularly, and King George VI.
Yeah.
And going right back to Nelson's time, King William, who became one of the Georges there, who served in the Navy. And Prince Philip, in a funny way, was carrying that on. I mean, Her Majesty must have felt this was very natural to be surrounded by naval people, naval officers, people who had that tradition, and that loyalty upwards and downwards that we have driven into us in the Navy, and which I think the Duke of Edinburgh absolutely epitomised.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you coming in. Thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Now, today marks the end of the greatest partnership in royal history, and not just because it has been the longest. Together, Elizabeth and Philip helped bring a stability to the monarchy and the country in a post-war and ever-changing world. Their love affair began in an era of letter writing, him to her. I have fallen in love completely and unreservedly. And a love affair it remained, the young Greek prince, the outsider, and the future Queen of England.
If the Duke of Edinburgh was renowned for his sense of duty, well, just as strong was his sense of fun. Look at these photographs of Philip in a biscuit-eating competition, which he won, and you'll see a boy who learned early on how to keep himself and others entertained. Spending his holidays in the homes of various relatives, like his Uncle Louis, Lord Mountbatten, whose daughter, Lady Pamela, remembers the young guest.
Great fun, extremely good-looking. If he saw you, you'd become the butt of a joke immediately, and which was very frightening if you're a small child.
But there was a sense of fun that surrounded him and his presence when
he
was
yes, life was never dull. Good heavens, no.
Mountbatten was the Royal Navy commander, who was also a friend and relative of the royal family. And he counselled Princess Elizabeth in the same way he'd been a mentor to Philip.
To learn the identity of the ships and the answers to a dozen problems at once, the Princess questions her cousin, Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten. A happy picture, this, and not to be forgotten.
And in the early days of their relationship, he did his best to encourage romance.
My father would try to help. And I remember an awful row with my father and Prince Philip. Philip was saying, for God's sake, keep away or you'll ruin everything.
Pose for the cameras in the palace.
The heir to the throne's engagement to the dashing young naval officer brought brightness to Britain's post-war gloom. And yet at court, this was a marriage which, to say the least, raised eyebrows.
Why is she not marrying a wholesome Scotsman? Why is she marrying this penniless Greek? But that was blown up out of all proportion. And it really caused a terrible hoo-ha. This unknown, boisterous Greek. Ooh, the court couldn't think of a more unsuitable consort for the future queen.
Elizabeth and Philip, of course, proved all the early doubters wrong. It was a successful marriage where a family was raised amid all of the pressures of public life. But as tempers frayed on one of the royal couple's early tours, the Queen's former lady-in-waiting remembers a relationship which had to weather all the ordinary stresses and strains.
That it's not very often that anybody criticises her. But to have a husband say, oh, don't be such a bloody fool. And then in Britannia, there were quite a few moments when, they'd have a little row. And she'd say, I'm going to shut myself in my cabin, and I'm not coming out until it's cooled down. Let me know when it's cooled down, and I'll come out.
How did you find out whether or not he was in a better mood?
By him stomping in or out.
Two strong characters, undoubtedly, but two people whose quiet devotion to one another has been obvious throughout their public life.
But they make a unique team together. We're very lucky to have two such strong people, and who were never rivals. He was always supporting her.
Marrying a future monarch meant that Prince Philip ended up serving his country in an entirely different way from the one he'd planned.
Did you have a sense from her perspective, Lady Pamela, of how important he was to her?
Nobody else in the world as important. If a young girl falls in love with a very handsome, very dynamic man, he will be her hero. Exasperating, many rows, but her hero the whole time.
You think he was her hero all the way through?
Yes, I do, yes.
Seen up close, this was an ordinary marriage in so many ways, but through the extraordinary demands that duty made, theirs was a love that was built to last. Geraint Vincent, News at 10.
Brilliantly revealing interview. Well, the sense of fun Lady Pamela was talking to Geraint about often got Prince Philip into trouble. He once said of himself, "I've just done what I think is my best. Some people think it's all right, some don't. What can you do?" Which, as a life philosophy, takes some beating. He had a sharp wit, and it did sometimes lead him into hot water, though anyone who covered the royal beat occasionally witnessed his remarks taken wildly out of context. He was often, he would say, just breaking the ice.
He was a man who took his role seriously, but also found humour. Supporting the Queen at countless events in all weathers, Prince Philip's sense of fun was never far away.
He liked to laugh. He had the ability to make the Queen laugh. He was often criticised because of his gaffes, but they weren't really gaffes, and most people were thinking that anyway. I'm reminded on one occasion, it was a press reception, I can't remember which country it was, but a reporter said, "How was your flight?" And quick as a flash, he said, "Have you ever flown?" The reporter said, "Yes, it was just like that." You couldn't help but laugh.
What the award does is it develops, most importantly, develops self-confidence.
Family also found themselves on the receiving end, like Prince Edward in a joint interview on the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme.
As you can see, he's got a gold award. But for that, he would have been a dropout.
Yeah, probably. My father was always capable of being able to manage interviews in a way and say things that the rest of us always dreamed we could say. And he was brilliant with them, always absolutely brilliant.
Oh, Steve, I mean, can you get Radio 3 on?
Fantastic sense of humour. But of course you can always misinterpret someone's humour. You can turn it against them so that it sounds if it's not right.
The press did not always see the funny side, particularly when a comment was interpreted as being culturally insensitive. Prince Philip was not slow to let those who wrote the headlines know what he thought of them.
We could see Philip coming over, and he sort of came over and he sort of tutted, and he said, "The trouble with you lot is you've got no sense of humour, a complete absence of humour."
However disapproving the headlines, the Duke's press secretary knew better than to question him.
You don't advise Philip on things like that, because they come at the spur of the moment, they come off the top of his head.
And so it continued into the later years, and a widely reported conversation with a sea cadet who told him she had another job.
And I just said that I worked in a club, and then he asked, "Oh, what, a strip club?"
What did you say to that?
Obviously I said no. And then he said, "Oh, it's a bit too cold today anyway."
Prince Philip was in his 90s when he provoked this reaction and the coverage that accompanied it. Opening a sexual health centre in central London, he had remarked, "At least you're all legitimate now."
He was clearly looking for a degree of mischief. I think he wanted to make people smile, and he did. It was fun, a little bit risque, and I think we probably all felt, thank goodness there are people like that in the world.
The humour was still there on the day he finally called a halt to royal engagements.
I'm sorry to hear you standing down.
Those who came to know him best say it's the wit and the sense of fun he brought to his role supporting the Queen that they're going to miss now. Paul Davis, News at 10.
With an absent father and a mother needing care in a mental institution, the closest thing the teenage prince had to a stable home was Gordonston in northeast Scotland. It was a new school then, founded by a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, as we said earlier. 13-year-old Philip was one of its original pupils, able, dynamic, popular, naughty, but never nasty, as one school report had it. He was both hockey and cricket captain and, in his final term, head boy, or guardian, as they call it there. He viewed Gordonston as having played a significant part in shaping his life.
A lone piper's lament. The flowers of the forest played, and the school flag was lowered to half-mast for the first time in almost 50 years. This Highland tribute was the Gordonston School's own way to honour the passing of one of their own. Long before he was a prince or a duke, the young Philip arrived here at Gordonston in September of 1934. He was a 13-year-old child who had a nomadic life across Europe and a troubled upbringing. But it was here at Gordonston in Moray where he says he became a man. He was among the school's first ever pupils, where they still keep a record of his early report cards and reflections from his teachers. The current principal at Gordonston reveals this insight into some of Philip's early misadventures.
It says that he got into a fair number of scrapes. He was naughty, but never nasty. And a great story of how, on his way to seamanship at Hopeman, he was quite an enthusiastic cyclist, but he narrowly avoided a clash with a baby in a pram because of his cycling prowess.
In many respects, the Duke of Edinburgh never fully left Gordonston.
I think that's absolutely right. Gordonston was part of the Duke of Edinburgh's life from when he became our 10th pupil in 1934 until just a few weeks ago, when I received my most recent letter from him. And last year we sent him some of our apple juice and our honey, which the students themselves had made, and they were delighted to receive a letter from him saying that when it arrived at Balmoral, it immediately made its way to the breakfast table and was thoroughly enjoyed.
At Gordonston, it was the school's founder, Kurt Hahn, who truly inspired Prince Philip with an education that went beyond the classroom. There were early morning runs through the Moray Hills, cold showers, and sailing was part of the education here. Philip took the school schooner all the way over to Norway on one trip, and Kurt Hahn introduced the young Duke to a life of service at Gordonston that leaves a legacy well beyond these school grounds. This is the origin of the Duke of Edinburgh Award. It's called the Moray Badge, and the young Prince Philip was one of its recipients. It was given to pupils here at Gordonston for their voluntary work and services in the local community. And then in 1956, Kurt Hahn convinced Prince Philip to put his name to the award and make it open to young people across the whole country. Ever since, more than 3 million people have received their Duke of Edinburgh Award. Prince Philip left a presence here. He was cricket captain, hockey captain and school guardian. He thrived so much he decided to send all his children to Gordonston to follow in his footsteps. Here he is dropping off a young Prince Charles to start life at the boarding school, though Charles famously found the physical challenges here quite miserable. The school's latest cricket captain, though, has reaped the benefits of the Duke's bursary to open up this education to a whole new generation.
I think, in honesty, it's life-changing. I think this is such a unique place that if you were to go to any other educational establishment, you wouldn't get the opportunities that you get to do here.
Prince Philip said he was at his happiest returning to Scotland's northeast, and many joyful summers with the Queen on the Balmoral estate took him back to childhood memories. Today, on the campus he helped build, the Duke of Edinburgh was remembered.
And Chris is here, as I mentioned at the top, to wind up and reflect on this day. Look, today is inevitably a reaction to, day responding to the, very sad news that he'd passed away. Tomorrow we begin to enter the sort of things that have been planned for so people can pay their respects and so on. So what happens tomorrow?
So some things will be going ahead as planned. It's the kind of ceremonial procedures that kick in place from tomorrow. So what you get tomorrow is what's called a death gun salute. So in places across the United Kingdom, like in Belfast, Cardiff, London, Edinburgh, there will be a gun salute. It also happens in Gibraltar And also, actually, on some Navy ships at sea, which is quite fitting, given that here is a man, one of the dwindling number of people who saw active service in the Second World War. In the Duke's case, it was with the Royal Navy, and someone who many people thought could go to the very top of the Royal Navy, as some of his ancestors had. So that gun salute kind of kicks in tomorrow. And interestingly, Tom, one of the guns at Woolwich Barracks, for example, were the same guns that were fired on the day of his wedding in 1947. So, you know, it just says everything you need to know about how long he's been with us.
We've talked a little bit earlier about the funeral, but it's clearly not going to be the funeral it would have been. But just tell us a little bit more about what to expect, you know, when it might be and who will be there and how it would be different.
So the most likely days that they've got available to them is next Friday or Saturday, or then the following Monday, depending on, you know, how much time it takes to put everything together. But as you say, there's a lot less to put together because the procession in London is no longer happening. Everything is kind of now happening behind the walls in Windsor. There's no public interface, if you like. Crowds are being urged not to gather. People are being asked not to lay flowers and instead make charitable donations, because at all times the royal family is aware that there are lots and lots of other people in this country who spent the past year not being able to have the funerals they wanted, and therefore what they do with the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, despite his importance, despite the fact he was the husband to the Queen, they will have to stick to government guidelines. Just on a further point on that, we do understand that Prince Harry will be coming back from California in order to attend. Now, if he does that, he's going to need to get on a plane, tomorrow or Sunday, in order to go through that 5-day quarantine period with tests in order to attend the funeral.
Just finally, you know, we heard Lord West talking about his naval career there, his war service. I mean, this really does feel like the end of an era, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And you know what? I thought Lady Pamela Hicks said earlier in her interview with Geraint, they were never rivals, the Queen and the Duke. And that was the sort of success that they had, that partnership they had, where he would step back and he would let the spotlight shine on her. And that was a very difficult thing to do in the 1950s. And you're right, it's the end of an era. A man who's been, you know, with us, part of national life since 1947. And that's why this is a very significant day.
Partners, not rivals. It's a very good place to end. Chris, thank you very much indeed. And that is where this special edition of News at 10 draws to a close, as the country remembers one of its most dedicated servants. Like many great men, Prince Philip's was a life of contradictions. His own upbringing was in a fractured family, yet he went on to make sure he held together the most famous family in the world. The powers that be didn't want an outsider to marry the Queen, royal prince or not. Over time, he of course proved just how wrong they were. His position at the heart of the family as devoted husband and father had meant shuffling his own ambition and his own family name to one side, to sit alongside the Queen and help make her reign one of the most successful in the long and complex history of our monarchy. To the end, though, he somehow managed to be liege man to the Queen, but his own man too. In the annals of history, he will be remembered for dedicating his life to the firm, as he called it, a father, a grandfather figure, you might say, to the nation. To his widow at Windsor tonight, it will be, as she put it, as a beloved husband. From all of us, good night.